The winter of 1873 came early to the Montana Territory, and it came to kill. Snow fell for days without mercy, swallowing the prairie, the fences, and every trace of the trails that once connected lonely ranches to the town of Cedar Ridge. The wind screamed down from the mountains like a wild spirit, carrying ice sharp enough to slice through skin. Nothing moved out there except death, and a single woman stumbling through the storm. Sarah Whitman could hardly feel her legs. Her blue calico dress hung in torn strips, frozen stiff against her skin. Her shawl was little more than frost-covered cloth. The wind bit at her cheeks until they burned, then turned them numb. Each step through the deep snow took everything she had left. She'd been walking since morning, though in the endless white she could no longer tell time. The town had thrown her out before sundown, and she'd been wandering ever since, searching for anywhere that wasn't full of hate. Cedar Ridge had been her home once. The folks there had smiled at her after her husband died, said kind words at the church brought her bread. But kindness in a small town could turn mean overnight. Rumors had started, ugly ones, about the widow who took in washing and spoke too freely to married men who came for their clothes. Mrs. Hartley, the banker's wife, had sworn she saw Sarah in a compromising situation with her husband. That was all it took. By the end of the week, Sarah couldn't walk the street without feeling eyes on her back. By the end of the month, she couldn't buy bread, rent a room, or speak without someone whispering her name like it was filth. Yesterday, her landlord told her she had until sunset to leave. "Can't have your sort here," he'd said, not meeting her eyes. Bad for business. So she'd packed what she could carry, pulled her shawl tight, and stepped out into the storm. Now her body was shaking beyond control, breath coming in shallow bursts that stung her lungs. She didn't even know what direction she was walking anymore. She only knew she couldn't stop. Stopping meant freezing to death. The snow was up to her knees now, heavy and wet. Her hands felt like they belonged to someone else, stiff and clumsy. Then, through the white blur, she saw a shape. Dark. Solid. Something man-made. A barn. She almost cried out, but her throat was too dry to make a sound. She stumbled forward, tripping more than walking, until her palms hit rough wood. Somehow, she got the door open. The warm, heavy smell of horses and hay wrapped around her. Steam rose from the animals' backs. For the first time in days, the air didn't sting when she breathed. Sarah dragged herself inside, closing the door against the wind. She sank down against the wall, gathering hay around her like a blanket. Her fingers wouldn't bend anymore. She tried to think, tried to remember her husband's face, the small cabin they once had, the sound of laughter, but everything was slipping away. The cold had sunk too deep. Her last thought before darkness took her was that maybe dying here, in peace and quiet, wasn't so bad. When Thomas Morrison opened the barn door a little while later, he didn't expect to find a body. He'd come to check on his horses, lantern in hand, worried the storm might spook them. But then he saw it, something small and still by the far wall. He moved closer, his boots crunching on frozen straw. It was a woman. "Ma'am?" he said, kneeling. Her skin was gray, her lips blue. When he touched her face, it was like touching ice. He leaned close and caught the faintest breath. Barely there. Thomas was a strong man, used to hard winters and harder work, but he'd seen enough of the frontier to know death when it was standing at his door. If he left her here, she'd be gone within the hour. Without thinking twice, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, like holding a snow-covered branch. The wind nearly tore her from his grasp as he pushed through the storm toward his house. It was only 50 yards away, but it felt like miles. He kicked the door open, stumbled inside, and laid her on the rug in front of the fireplace. Her skin was still like marble. He piled on wood until the flames roared, then fetched blankets from the trunk, wrapping her tightly. But the heat wasn't reaching her. Her lips were still blue, her breath weaker. He knew the stories, heard old trappers talk about how to save someone from the freeze. It was indecent, maybe, but it worked. Skin-to-skin warmth, the only way to bring life back. Thomas hesitated just long enough to feel shame, then pushed it aside. This wasn't about propriety. This was about life or death. He carried her to his bed. His hands shook as he worked the frozen dress free from her stiff body, doing his best not to look. He stripped down to his union suit, pulled her against him under the heavy quilts, and held her tight. Her skin was so cold it burned his own. He kept whispering, "Come on now, breathe, stay with me." Hours passed like that. The storm outside battered the walls, but inside he stayed still, letting his own body heat fight death for hers. Slowly, he felt her chest begin to move more deeply. Her lips lost their purple hue. Then, suddenly, her whole body shuddered. She was shivering again. It was a good sign. It meant her body was fighting back. By dawn, she stirred. Thomas felt her move, felt her tense. He spoke softly, afraid she'd panic. "Easy now. You're safe. You nearly froze by my barn. I brought you inside." She blinked, confusion and fear in her eyes. She tried to speak, but her voice was only a whisper. He nodded. "You're at my ranch, Thomas Morrison. I had to. There was no other way to keep you warm enough to live." Her eyes filled with tears, a mix of shock, relief, and shame. Thomas didn't look away. "You're alive," he said gently. "That's what matters." Outside, the wind still howled across the endless white. But inside that small Montana ranch house, two strangers shared warmth, born not from sin, but from mercy. Neither of them yet knew it, but the storm that had nearly killed her was about to change both their lives forever. Sarah woke to the sound of wood crackling in a fireplace and the faint smell of coffee. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then it came rushing back. The blizzard, the barn, the cold that had crept into her bones until she thought she'd never feel warmth again. She opened her eyes. The room was simple but clean, built of rough-hewn logs. A single window looked out onto a world still wrapped in white. Her own dress hung near the fire, torn and stiff from frost, and she realized with a shock that she was wearing a man's shirt, far too big and falling past her knees. Panic fluttered in her chest. Where was she? What had happened after she'd passed out? The door opened quietly, and a man stepped in carrying a tray. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face tanned and roughened by the sun and wind. His eyes were the color of the Montana sky, clear and steady. "You're awake," he said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "I brought you some broth. You need to eat something." Sarah pulled the quilt up higher, her hands trembling. "Where am I?" "This is the Morrison Ranch," he replied gently. "I'm Thomas Morrison. You near froze to death in my barn last night." He stayed a few steps away, careful not to crowd her. The kindness in his eyes was a strange thing after so many months of cold looks and cruel whispers. "You're safe here until the storm passes," he added. "Safe," she repeated softly as if testing the word. It had been a long time since she'd felt anything close to that. Thomas gestured toward the chair by the fire. "Your dress is there, though it's seen better days. My late wife's clothes are in that trunk. You're welcome to anything that fits." Sarah's gaze flicked to the trunk, then back to him. "Your wife?" "She passed 3 winters ago," he said quietly. "Fever." "I'm sorry," she murmured. He nodded once. "We all lose someone out here." Silence filled the room, broken only by the storm's moaning outside. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice low. "I shouldn't be here, if people knew." Thomas frowned. "If people knew what?" "They'd say things," she whispered. "They already do. About me. The town. They say I'm not decent." Understanding flickered in his eyes. "I know who you are," he said. "Sarah Whitman, widow of James Whitman, Cedar Ridge's favorite gossip subject." Her breath caught. "Then why? Why did you help me?" Quote, "Because it was the right thing to do," Thomas answered simply. "Cedar Ridge loves to talk about sin, but I found most of them wouldn't know decency if it bit them. You needed help, and I wasn't about to let you die in my barn because of their small minds." Sarah blinked hard, trying not to cry. No one had spoken to her like that in months. "Eat," he said softly. "You need your strength." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing." His cheeks colored slightly. Last night, when I found you, you were too far gone for blankets to help. The only way to warm someone that close to death is with body heat. I did what was needed to save your life, and I kept it proper as I could. I thought you ought to know." Sarah's face flushed hot with embarrassment, but beneath it was something else, a deep gratitude that knotted her throat. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a small nod and left her to rest. When she felt strong enough, Sarah slipped from bed and opened the trunk. The clothes inside smelled faintly of lavender and memories. She found a simple brown dress and dressed quickly, grateful for the warmth. The house was bigger than she expected. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a main room with sturdy furniture, and the signs of a life once shared. A woman's apron still hung on a hook. A half-finished embroidery lay folded in a basket. Sarah built up the fire and, out of habit, began to tidy the kitchen. She found flour, beans, and salt pork, and soon the smell of biscuits filled the small house. It felt good to be useful again. When Thomas came in from the barn, his coat dusted with snow, he stopped short. "You should be resting," he said, surprise softening into something warmer. "I've rested enough," she replied, "and I don't take charity without giving something back." She set a plate in front of him, and for a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, it was quiet, except for the clink of forks. After a while, Thomas said, "Storm will keep us snowed in another 2 days, maybe 3. Sarah nodded, eyes fixed on her plate. "And when it passes," he looked up, "then you can go if that's what you want." She gave a small, bitter laugh. "Go where? There's nowhere left for me. No one will hire me. No one will speak to me. I'm already dead to them." Thomas leaned back in his chair. "You could stay here a while, help around the place. I could use the extra hands." Her eyes widened. People would talk. "Let them," he said flatly. "I stopped caring about talk a long time ago." She hesitated, torn between fear and hope. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," he said. "You work hard, you cook better than I do, and you've survived more than most could." Something in his tone broke through her defenses. For months she'd been unwanted, untouchable. Now this man, a stranger, was offering her a place not out of pity, but respect. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay, at least until the snow clears." "Good," Thomas said simply, though the hint of a smile tugged at his mouth. That night, the wind battered the windows, but inside the small house, it was quiet. Sarah lay awake in the bedroom, listening to the creak of the floorboards as Thomas settled near the fire. She thought of his hands holding her through the night, not with desire, but with mercy. She thought of how he'd faced the storm for a stranger. In the main room, Thomas stared into the fire and thought about her too, the woman who'd walked through hell and still found the strength to stand. He hadn't realized how empty the house had been until she filled it with the sound of breathing, the smell of cooking, and something else he hadn't felt in years: peace. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside the Morrison Ranch, 2 wounded souls began, without knowing it, to thaw. The storm broke on the 4th morning, leaving behind a world that looked almost unreal. Snow lay heavy and untouched across the land, sparkling like crushed glass beneath the pale sun. Sarah stood by the window, wrapped in a borrowed shawl, watching Thomas shovel a path to the barn. For the first time in months, her heart didn't ache with fear or shame. The silence of the prairie felt clean, like a new beginning. They had fallen into a quiet rhythm. She cooked, mended, and kept the house warm. Thomas saw to the livestock and chopped firewood until his coat was dusted white each evening. They spoke little at first, both careful not to step on ghosts, but gradually the silence softened into conversation. She found herself laughing one afternoon over his story of a horse that had once stolen his hat and refused to give it back. The sound startled them both. By the end of that week, the road into town had begun to clear. Over coffee one morning, Thomas said carefully, "If you want to go back to Cedar Ridge, the trail's open now." Sarah looked down at her cup. "Go back to what? More whispers? More stones thrown at my back?" He nodded slowly. "You could go somewhere else. Start over. I'll take you as far as you need." She turned toward the window, the light catching her dark hair. Everywhere I go, people will ask questions. Once gossip starts, it follows you like a shadow. Thomas watched her for a moment. Then stay here. I need help, and you need a place. You'd have your own room, your own pay. It would be proper. Her chest tightened. People will talk. Let them, he said simply. I don't answer to them. She studied him, searching for some sign of pity or desire. There was none. Just quiet steadiness. All right, she said softly. I'll stay. From that moment, everything began to change. When the spring thaw came, the land came alive again. Snowmelt turned to rivers, and the grass rose green from the brown earth. Together they mended fences, planted a garden, and rebuilt what the winter had taken. Sometimes, Thomas caught her humming while she worked. Soft, wordless songs that made him smile without knowing why. Other times she caught him watching her from across the yard, his blue eyes full of something he couldn't quite hide. One afternoon she found him in the corral with a young colt, coaxing it gently to accept a halter. His patience amazed her. You talk to animals better than people, she said with a teasing smile. He laughed, a deep, warm sound she hadn't heard before. Animals listen better. When the colt shied away, he turned to her. Come here, let's see if he trusts you. She hesitated, then stepped into the corral. The colt snorted, but didn't run. Thomas stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his breath stir her hair. Hold your hand steady, he said quietly, guiding her wrist. His hand was warm and rough, his voice low. Let him come to you. The colt inched forward, sniffed her palm, then nuzzled it. Sarah laughed, a light, unguarded sound that made Thomas's heart twist. For a moment, they stood like that, his hand over hers, the air between them heavy with something neither dared name. Then he stepped back, his face flushed from more than sun. That evening, as the sun burned low, they sat on the porch. The prairie stretched golden before them. You've done wonders for this place, Thomas said softly. Feels like a home again. Sarah looked at him. Maybe it just needed a woman's touch. He met her eyes. Maybe it just needed you. The words hung between them, fragile and true. But before either could speak, the wind shifted, bringing the faint jingle of harnesses. Riders. Thomas stood, his face hardening. Stay inside. She moved to the window as 6 men rode up, the banker, the judge's son, and others from Cedar Ridge. Their faces were full of judgment. The banker called out, We've come for the woman, Morrison. You can't keep her here. It's indecent. Thomas stepped off the porch, jaw set. She's under my roof and my protection. That's all you need to know. You're a fool, another shouted. She'll ruin you like she ruins everything she touches. Say that again, Thomas said quietly. The man spat. She's filth. Thomas's fist moved faster than words. The man dropped like a sack of grain. The others surged forward. Within seconds, fists flew. Snow sprayed up under boots as the fight broke loose. Sarah grabbed the rifle from over the fireplace and stepped onto the porch. Her voice rang through the chaos. Enough! She fired a warning shot into the air. The crack of it froze every man where he stood. The next one won't miss, she said, her voice steady though her hands trembled. Now, get off this land. The men backed off slowly, dragging their injured friend to his horse. As they mounted up, the banker turned. You've made a mistake, Morrison. You'll regret this. When they were gone, Sarah dropped the rifle and ran to Thomas. His lip was split, blood streaking his cheek. You're hurt, she said, her voice shaking. I've had worse, he murmured. You shouldn't have come out. You'd be dead if I hadn't. Their eyes met, hers fierce with fear, his soft with something far deeper. Sarah, he said quietly, you can't stay here now. They'll come back. Then let them, she whispered. I'm not running anymore. He stared at her, then said in a voice rough with emotion, Marry me. She froze. What? Marry me, he repeated. Not someday. Now. Let them come for my wife if they dare. I love you, Sarah. I have since the day you stepped into this house. Her throat tightened. Thomas, they'll never accept us. Then we'll make our own place. Quote, she looked at him, this stubborn, kind man who had carried her from the snow, who had fought for her name, the answer came easy. "Yes," she said softly, "I'll marry you." They wed the next day, a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who asked no questions. For the first time in years, Sarah felt whole. But Cedar Ridge did not forgive easily. Word of their marriage spread like wildfire. Merchants refused to sell to them, the mill turned them away, and the bank called in its loan. When Thomas's barn mysteriously burned one night, Sarah saw him kneel in the ashes, his face streaked with soot and grief. "I'll rebuild," he said quietly. And he did, because men like him always did. With help from a few brave neighbors and a group of Mexican ranch hands who didn't care about gossip, the Morrison Ranch rose again. When the next storm came, half the town showed up with wagons of lumber and food. The tide had turned. Some hearts had softened, others had simply grown tired of hate. By the next winter, the ranch thrived, and every night, when the wind howled outside, Sarah and Thomas sat by the fire together, their hands intertwined. Once, she had nearly frozen alone in a barn. Now, she was warm in every way a person could be. The woman the town had tried to destroy had found love stronger than any storm, and the rancher who saved her life had found something worth living for again. Outside, the Montana sky stretched wide and silver, and inside the Morrison house, the fire burned bright.